Tourist Season by Brenda Novak. Performed by Amy McFadden. 1. Ismay Chalmers had never faced such terrible weather. A farmer's daughter, born and raised in a small town in northern Utah, she'd seen the occasional blizzard during winter, a 20-year drought, and scars left by wildfires once. But she'd never experienced anything even close to a hurricane. "I can't believe this is happening," she told Remy Windsor, her fiancé, over the phone. "You have nothing to worry about," he said, but his words sounded hollow. She was alone on an island off Cape Cod that was only 10 miles long and 5 miles wide, facing shrieking gale-force winds that seemed determined to claw the house apart, and dark roiling clouds that blocked out the sun so completely it could have been nighttime instead of mid-afternoon. "Easy for you to say. You're sitting in sunny L.A., she grumbled. Just imagining the balmy spring weather he was experiencing made her wish she'd stayed in California. She would have waited for him, but after passing the bar, there'd been nothing for her to do while he continued to study almost 24/7 for the third and final part of the United States medical licensing exam, which would enable him to become a medical doctor. Instead, she'd flown to Mariner's Island ahead of him to get settled while he finished up. He was supposed to join her in 3 weeks. Then they'd spend the rest of May and all of June in paradise, unwinding from the pressure they'd been under, both before they knew each other and after, obtaining their bachelor's degrees at UCLA, passing the exams necessary to get into higher education at the same school, and earning their advanced degrees. "The storm won't be as bad as it seems," he insisted. "Like Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, Mariner's is an outlier that gets far more nor'easters than hurricanes. Those can be bad enough, of course, but they only come in the winter. And hurricane season doesn't start until August." When the wind had first come up, she'd checked the internet. She knew what he said was accurate, but there were always exceptions. "Hurricanes almost always slam into the coast farther south," he continued as she moved to the living room window to be able to watch what was happening outside. "They lessen in severity before moving north, or they curve into the Atlantic." Feeling the house shudder around her did nothing to build her confidence. Windsor Cottage, a play on Windsor Castle using his family's last name, was located at the end of a lane called Land's End, because it was on the easternmost tip of the island. When a jagged bolt of lightning electrified the sky, she could see the angry froth of the sea churning not far away, watched a giant wave rise up and come crashing down on the beach. "It's hard to feel safe when I'm afraid the house will blow down and be swept into the ocean," she said. "The house won't blow down and be swept into the ocean," he said with a chuckle. "It's been in the family for almost a century. Everything will be fine." Maybe he was right, and she was overreacting. That wouldn't be too surprising, considering she was staying in an unfamiliar house in a part of the world she'd never visited before. "I just wish I'd waited for you. I don't know what I was thinking, flying off ahead of you." "You were thinking of spending your days on the beach, reading escape novels and getting a tan. You've worked so hard. You deserve to celebrate with a sun-drenched vacation on Mariner's. That's why my parents insisted we use the cottage." The word cottage was an understatement. Summer home would be a more accurate term. The house was worth millions. But she wasn't going to argue over semantics. She'd grown up with 7 younger siblings and tired parents who worked from dawn till dusk to provide everything they could for their family. But she'd never known the type of affluence Remy had. His father was a diamond broker in New York City, like his father before him, and thanks to his incredible success, Remy's mother had never had to work. "I just feel so alone and vulnerable." "Stop," You'll wake up in the morning, the sun will be shining, and you'll be glad you went ahead of me. You passed the bar in February. You've had to sit around twiddling your thumbs enough while I study." He was right about that. She'd cracked open her share of textbooks, but she hadn't had to study nearly as hard as he had, and the fact that he was never available was getting old. She was becoming concerned about their relationship. When they met nearly 3 years ago, she'd been so impressed by his drive and ability, how he always had everything under control. They'd moved in together a year later and gotten engaged, informally for now, 9 months ago. But she no longer felt like a priority. Maybe marriage would be a mistake. She'd recently told him she was having a few misgivings, and he'd said things would change once they had their hardest years behind them. She'd decided to wait and see, when he wasn't so stressed. "I'll be there before you know it," he promised. Enough whimpering about the storm, she told herself. He didn't have much patience for weakness, much patience at all, now that she thought of it. She was about to change the subject and ask how confident he was feeling about Part 3, his upcoming exam, when the lights flickered. "I think I'm going to lose power," she said instead, feeling a fresh burst of panic. "I'm sure my folks have candles and flashlights and that sort of thing." "Where?" she asked, suddenly desperate to find them. "I'll call and ask." How long would that take? She drew a deep breath. "Okay, hurry." As soon as she disconnected, she started rummaging through the cupboards and drawers in the kitchen, thinking she might stumble on what she needed. To prepare for a hurricane, or a bad storm like this, the information online indicated she should have a gallon of water, food, a flashlight, a battery-powered radio, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and a whistle to use to be able to call for help. Although, hopefully, it wouldn't get that bad. The list was even more extensive than that, but she figured she'd be happy if she could just gain possession of the top 3 items. Fortunately, she'd purchased groceries once she'd landed and bought filtered water. After she left the kitchen, she managed to locate a flashlight in the mudroom at the back of the house. Relieved, she turned it on, then groaned. The beam was so weak. It needed new batteries. She was also worried about the battery in her cell phone. She'd been charging it since before the storm started, but it ran down quickly, in a couple of hours. She'd been meaning to do something about that, but she'd been living on student loans and a modest paycheck from the coffee shop where she worked, and would need every cent she could scrape together to set up her law practice this summer. She could have joined a firm instead, but she'd chosen to go out on her own so she wouldn't be beholden to the demands or whims of those more powerful than she was, and could retain control of her own destiny. She still considered that a good decision, but putting off getting her phone fixed? Not so much. It didn't matter a great deal in LA. There she was almost always near a working outlet. But what if that wasn't the case here? What if she lost power and it took all night or longer to restore it? She'd be completely cut off. With everyone having a cell phone these days, Remy's parents had seen no reason to keep a landline when they had the house renovated last fall. Shit! After returning to the kitchen, where she'd left her phone, she tapped her fingers on the counter, willing Remy to call back. But he'd been so cavalier and unconcerned, so sure everything would be fine, she wasn't convinced he'd act quickly. A large boom sounded. She had no idea what it was. It sounded more like something had crashed into the house than thunder. But it convinced her she'd be a fool to waste any more time waiting for him. Taking only the small flashlight she'd found, she left her charging phone behind to poke through the other rooms. Surely she'd find a bevy of stronger flashlights. The house was built on an island, for God's sake. The only way to reach Mariners was by boat or plane, and bad weather routinely cut it off from the mainland. But no one had spent much time at the cottage since it was gutted and remodeled, so a lot of everyday items hadn't yet been replaced. The lights went out before she could reach the second story. She was only halfway up the stairs when it happened, leaving her in a thick, humid darkness that felt like plasma. As she listened to the wind howl through the eaves and the house creak in protest, she realized she was going to have to go ahead and use the weak flashlight. "What a nightmare," she muttered and hit the switch. A dim yellow circle illuminated the next step and then the next. The beam couldn't reach far, which made her nervous. She needed to decide where she'd spend her time until the power came back on, because if she couldn't find another source of light, she wouldn't be able to move about in this unfamiliar place. It wasn't as if she could rely on her phone as a flashlight. She might need what cell power she had for more important things. Chances were she'd just have to wait out the storm in the dark, hoping the power came back on sooner than later, or that the skies would clear enough by tomorrow morning that she'd be able to see the sun. Once she reached the landing, she sought out the bathrooms. She was relieved to find several decorative scented candles by the soaking tub in the master bedroom, but there weren't any matches. Hoping she might run across a lighter in one of the boys' rooms, she brought 2 candles with her and left them near the wall at the top of the stairs before going into the first door off the hallway. Although this room had been updated, like the rest of the house, there was a graduation picture of Remy on the dresser from when he got his bachelor's, along with some old baseball and soccer trophies. Remy had insisted she take the master. "Might as well be as comfortable as possible, Liz. We can always switch rooms if my parents make it out to visit us." So she wasn't staying in his old room, but she knew this had belonged to him. She'd seen it yesterday when she first arrived and explored the house. She searched his drawers, but most were empty, since the furniture was new. She did find several boxes in the closet filled with old clothes and memorabilia, and guessed his mother had asked the workmen to put his belongings there for him to sort through the next time he returned to the island. After digging through clothes, old schoolwork, and things he'd made as a child, she lost confidence she'd find what she needed in those boxes, and started to feel along the top shelf of his closet. Could he have hidden a bong or some marijuana with a lighter? He smoked on occasion, and once told her he'd started young. Although the closet would be the most likely place to find that type of thing, she couldn't reach all the way to the back, so she climbed up on one of the heaviest boxes and used her flashlight to see. There was no bong, no lighter or matches either. She found a ballpoint pen, a random bookmark, and a spiral binder with Remy's name drawn on the cover in colorful graffiti-like letters, and pages filled with incredible drawings. She'd known Remy was talented. He'd done a number of sketches, including a picture of her dog before she had to put him down 3 months ago, and quite a few human bodies, showing the detailed anatomy of the organs, muscles, and ligaments. He said it was a great way for him to study, and she could see why that might be the case. But the drawings in this book weren't quite so clinical. These depicted violence, knives dripping with blood, torture devices, and mutilated bodies. With a grimace, she closed the binder and put it back. She couldn't understand why Remy, or anyone else, would have the desire to draw such things. But a lot of teenage boys were fascinated with the macabre. Even though she found those graphic images unsettling, disturbing, especially while her flashlight was fading and she was likely to be left in the dark, stranded alone in this cottage by the sea, she shouldn't make too much of it. Coming to this place had seemed like such a treat before the storm rolled in, she mused. But right now, she'd rather be in the cramped, kitschy, well-loved 4-bedroom farmhouse where she'd grown up, even if all her siblings were home and arguing over religion and politics, as they often did. She was about to scramble down and move on to Remy's twin brother's room when a loose board along the back of the shelves caught her eye. There it is. That had to be where he'd hidden his marijuana, she thought. Lifting the loose board revealed a hole in the wall that contained a small nylon duffel bag, the kind an athlete would use to carry their equipment. She reached for it, then hesitated. She was already a little shaken by what she'd seen in that notebook. Should she really press on? This wasn't her house. She had no right to invade Remy's privacy. After all, she'd just seen a part of her fiancé, even if it was from when he was much younger, that she didn't find appealing. And they didn't need any more strain on their relationship. But if this was indeed a bong, and there were matches or a lighter with it, she'd have candles and a way to use them. She wasn't doing anything wrong, she reassured herself, and got down so she could use both hands. After unzipping the duffel, she pointed her flashlight inside it. But she didn't find what she'd expected. The bag contained several pieces of cheap jewelry, a torn picture of some girl who looked to be 18 or 19, and a handful of women's underwear. She picked up a pair of yellow bikini briefs and quickly dropped them again. Why would Remy have a bag of women's jewelry and panties hidden so carefully in his closet? Her mind raced, and her heart began to pound. Like the drawings, the contents of the duffel could fall within the range of what was normal for a young boy to have, couldn't it? Young boys were, of course, notoriously curious about women. But what she'd found didn't feel normal. That was the problem. Whose panties were they? Where had they come from? And how long had they been there? Whatever the answers to those questions, she wished she'd never found the notebook or the bag. She'd lived with Remy for 2 of the 3 years they'd been together, but this made her wonder if she really knew him. He was so highly focused on school, on himself. He didn't open up a lot. What was going on inside his head? These items made her wonder like she'd never wondered before. Intending to get back up on the boxes so she could put the bag away, she turned, but her flashlight died at that moment, leaving her standing in Remy's old room, blinking widely without being able to see a thing, except those horrific drawings and the yellow bikini briefs in the duffel she was holding, both of which were indelibly etched into her brain. 2. Beau Broussard had seen the woman pull into the drive of the main house yesterday. He'd been watching for her. Annabelle Windsor had called to let him know her son and his fiancée, Ismay Chalmers, would be coming to spend the rest of spring and part of summer, and he'd done his job by making sure the cottage was ready. Beau didn't live directly on the premises, but he lived on the property tucked behind, which was also owned by Mort and Annabelle Windsor. They provided him with a small caretaker's cabin, a Ford F-250 truck, and a modest salary in exchange for looking after the property, keeping teenagers and would-be vandals away when it wasn't in use, maintaining the grounds, and performing minor repairs here and there. His cabin wasn't only smaller, it was located farther from the ocean, and it was mostly hidden by trees. But he preferred it that way. Everyone else wanted to be right on the beach. He just wanted to maintain his privacy. Glancing down at his phone again, he sighed. He had to go out in the weather. Annabelle had just texted him to say the cottage had lost power, which didn't come as any surprise since he'd lost power too, and Remy's fiancé was sitting over there in the dark, alone and frightened. Although he had to make do with a lantern and other emergency supplies, like most regular people in such a situation, the big house had a generator that was supposed to come on. Why hadn't that happened? He'd tested it when he installed it, and it had worked perfectly. But it was the first generator he'd ever dealt with. He should have gotten a professional to handle the installation. He would have if it wasn't so damn hard to hire a contractor on the island. The few electricians, plumbers, and other tradesmen they had were booked weeks or months, sometimes years, in advance. Not only had he installed the generator, he'd helped with other aspects of the renovation. Cub Holliday, the most successful contractor on Mariners, was diagnosed with cancer before he could finish the project. Though Cub was in much better health these days, Beau had done the rest of the work for the Windsors, or as much of it as he could, given his lack of experience. Construction was almost second nature to him, but there were still plenty of things he had yet to learn. "On my way," he texted back and yanked on a coat and boots before grabbing his toolbox, a lantern for the stranded woman, and a waterproof flashlight for himself. "It's all about giving the rich people what they want," he muttered as he stepped outside. But he wasn't bitter. He'd gotten lucky landing his job with the Windsors, and he knew it. When he came to the island looking for a summer gig in the tourist industry, he'd had no idea he'd still be here. But he'd adopted a fake surname and created a bogus work history, and, so far, the Windsors hadn't bothered to follow up. He didn't plan to give them any reason to do so in the future. It was mid-April, but the weather made it feel like January. Leaning into the wind, he squinted against the rain stinging his face as he stepped over a huge branch that had been torn from an oak tree and taken part of the fence surrounding the garden down with it. There'd be significant cleanup to do later, but at least that branch hadn't hit the house. It easily could have. The cottage sat, dark and brooding, a hulking giant perched on the last outcropping of land, seemingly staring with resolute determination at the angry sea. Beau turned a wary eye on the 15-foot waves as he made his way to the front walk. The tide seemed dangerously high. But he'd only lived on Mariners for 2 years. He couldn't imagine this storm was anything notable to those who'd been here a while. Or was he assuming too much? There was a first for everything. Who would have expected the strange series of events that had derailed his life when he was only 18? The wind blew down his hood, but his hands were full, so he couldn't pull it back up. He trudged on doggedly, ignoring the elements raging around him, and finally achieving a small reprieve when he climbed up the stairs to the porch, where the deep overhang provided a modicum of protection. Anxious to start the damn generator so he could return to his own place and get warm again, he pressed the doorbell, then knocked immediately after. "Ms. Chalmers, it's Beau Broussard, the caretaker," he called above the wind. "Annabelle Windsor sent me over. I've got a lantern here you can use until I get the generator going." He waited what felt like several minutes, but there was no response. Figuring he'd just get the lights on so she wouldn't need a lantern, he started back down the stairs as the door cracked open. "Mr. Broussard?" Ducking back under the overhang, he angled his flashlight below the woman's chin so he could see her without blinding her. From what he could tell, she had flawless, dewy-looking skin, the roundest eyes he'd ever seen, though he couldn't make out the color, and curly blonde hair that was currently pulled back in a ponytail. She was surprisingly tall, too. He was 6'5", so she had to be 5'11", 6 feet? Was she some kind of model? Leave it to Remy to find such a stunning woman to become his wife. That dude had the best of everything. Although Beau had only met Remy 3 times since he'd started working for the Windsors, the summer he was first hired, Thanksgiving the same year, and the 4th of July last summer, right before they started the renovations, he didn't care for either of Annabelle's boys. They both seemed unashamedly arrogant and spoiled. They couldn't even get along with each other. Weren't identical twins supposed to be close? Almost inseparable? At least Remy was doing something with his life. He would soon be a medical doctor. Bastian, on the other hand, was supposed to be working in the diamond industry with his father, but Beau got the impression he did more traveling and partying than anything else. Beau had heard Annabelle complain about Bastian's behavior on many occasions. "Money ruins people, Beau," she'd say when she came out to help him in the large garden she left in his care when she wasn't around. "Wealth is a blessing, but it's also a curse." He wished he'd been cursed the way the Windsors had. They'd never been without food on the table, a roof over their heads, that sort of thing. He'd grown up poor, first in Florida, and then, when he was orphaned at 10, in a small parish in Louisiana, where he was raised by a great-uncle who lived on Grand Isle with almost nothing. Off the grid, as Uncle Chester liked to say, which meant he had no government help, taxes, or other normal connections to the rest of society. The bullying Beau had received at school for wearing pants that were too small or shoes with holes so big the soles flapped as he walked had been almost unbearable, until he'd learned how to fight. Then the other kids had become too frightened to taunt him, but he'd always known he didn't fit in. Unfortunately, so had they. He tried not to remember the years immediately following the incident that had taken his mother's life. Prison, almost 9 years later, after a lengthy trial, had been less traumatic. At least while he was behind bars, he'd had 3 square meals a day, clean clothes, well-established rules, and there'd been a clearly understood pecking order. And since he'd already learned to fight, he hadn't been scared. That he wouldn't take any shit from anyone was something he'd established the day they'd first locked him up. He'd spent the next month in the hole, as a result, where he'd thought he'd go insane. But he survived, and it was drawing that line that had made the rest of his time behind bars tolerable. Because of that, and his size, he hadn't had to click up with a gang, hadn't gotten involved with anyone he didn't want to. The other inmates quickly learned if they left him alone, he'd mind his own business, too. Still, the memories he most wanted to avoid, right after his mother had been killed, popped up every now and then. Kids found the damnedest reasons to torment other kids. It was probably thanks to those experiences that he preferred his own company to anyone else's, and that was why this job suited him so well. If he had to get a generator going in the middle of the worst storm he'd seen on Mariners, no big deal. It was a minor inconvenience, all things considered. He handed the lantern he'd brought to the willowy, slender woman fighting to hang onto the door so it wouldn't blow against the inside wall. "I brought this for you to use while I start the generator." She used her knee to keep the door in place and switched her cell phone to her other hand so she could accept the lantern. "The generator?" she echoed above the storm. "Yeah, it's supposed to come on automatically once the power goes out, but it's new since the renovation, and I'll get it going," he finished, cutting himself off. She needed power, not a 15-minute explanation as to why she didn't have any. "Thank you." She seemed polite and genuinely relieved. "No problem." He pulled up his hood and started to turn away for the second time, but she stopped him. "Fixing the generator is something you have to do outside? In this weather? Will you be okay?" The wind threw her voice around, but he was able to catch the gist of her words. The fact that she'd even consider his well-being told him she was a better person than the man she was going to marry. "I'll be fine." He got the impression she was watching as he fought his way down the stairs. He wasn't sure why she hadn't simply gone in and shut the door, but he tended to draw attention wherever he went, despite his desire not to. Part of it was his size, he supposed. Not many men were taller than he was. And he was broad, too, especially through the shoulders, something that had only become more pronounced since he started lifting weights in prison, a habit he'd continued after being released, because it was like yoga for him. The focus and determination it required quieted his mind. By the time he reached the ground and looked back, she was gone. A second later, he saw a dim light appear in the window. She'd turned on the lantern, which made him glad he'd gone to the extra effort of bringing it to her. Ismay took the lantern the Windsor's caretaker had brought into the living room with its many sculptures and other expensive art and sank onto the soft leather couch. She'd have power soon. She no longer had to fear she'd regret using her cell phone, so she called Remy again.
"Did Beau get the power on?"
he asked in lieu of a greeting. Ismay turned the ring on her finger so she could see the tiny diamond. She and Remy had talked a lot about marriage during their time together, but she hadn't let him buy her an official engagement ring yet. She'd known he wasn't really the one who'd be paying for it, not while he was in school, and that bothered her, especially because she knew he'd push her to get something big and expensive. They'd compromised with a dainty promise ring in yellow gold. Not yet. He's working on it, though. And he brought me a lantern, so I'm no longer stranded in the dark.
Good. I told you everything would be fine.
An image of the man she'd just met rose in her mind. He had dark, distrusting eyes, a strong jaw covered with razor stubble, hollow cheeks, short dark hair that had been plastered to his head by the rain, and he'd been huge, a mountain of a man. She was 6'1", and he had her by at least 4 inches, maybe more. You did tell me that, she said. Beau seems capable enough. I'm sure he'll get the lights back on before too long.
You didn't find any candles?
He'd never told her where they might be. Ismay wished she'd never even searched for emergency supplies. Then she wouldn't have discovered what was in Remy's closet. She wanted to at least mention the underwear and jewelry, wanted to hear what he had to say about them. There was a possibility they weren't his. Beau had access to the house, which was more than a little unnerving, considering his size and the fact she hadn't even realized there was a strange man moving about the property. As polite as he'd been at the door, she'd seen enough true crime shows to know what those items in the duffel could signify. The police called them trophies. Of course, it was the notebook paired with what she'd found in the bag that had taken her mind down such a dark alley. The items in that duffel could merely be tokens of Remy's past conquests. Still, what kind of guy would keep a memento from each woman he slept with?
Ismay?
Remy said. She blinked and drew her attention back to the phone. What?
Are you going to answer me?
Oh, sorry. She cleared her throat. This storm has me distracted. I found some candles in the master bathroom, but there was nothing to light them with.
Good thing you no longer need them. You should ask Beau for a lighter, though, just in case.
Do you think he'll take the lantern he brought me?
Who knows? I doubt the generator will fail once he gets it going, but it's better to be prepared.
I'll ask him. She nibbled on her bottom lip as she tried to decide what to say, or not say, to Remy about what she'd found. She craved reassurance, but the question alone and what it implied would upset him. Should she just assume it was someone else, that it was Bastian, the contractor, or Beau? She supposed if it wasn't Remy, Bastian was more likely to have hidden that bag than the others. Although she had yet to meet him, Remy often talked about what his brother was like, said he had no direction in his life, couldn't accomplish anything, preferred to live off the family fortune, and on and on. In the end, it was the notebook that stopped her from saying anything. Those drawings had obviously been Remy's. She'd seen his work before and recognized it, which made her believe the other stuff had to be his, too. I know you're busy, she said. I'll let you get back to studying.
Okay, you're in good hands now.
She almost disconnected, but then she thought of something she wanted to ask. Remy?
Yes?
How often have you been here since you graduated from high school? The last time he'd visited had been a little less than a year ago. She knew that because she'd been in Utah visiting her own family at the time.
Almost every summer, and some holidays. The Islanders make a big deal of Christmas and have Santa come over on a ferry and stuff. Why?
Wishing the lights would hurry and come back on, she frowned at the shadows Beau's lantern cast on the walls. I just wondered if you're going to like the renovations.
You told me yesterday they look great,
he said, sounding confused. They do, she reassured him. but I never saw the cottage before, so I don't know how much it's changed. Did your mother have the contractor put the shelves and organizers in the closets, or paint them?" She held her breath, hoping he'd say yes.
No, it was mostly new siding, a new roof, an open layout for the kitchen, living room, and bar area, and a new master bath along with hardwood floors throughout. Why?
"No reason," she lied. "I was just curious how extensive it was."
It was extensive enough. It cost a fortune and took 9 months. But nothing happens fast on Mariners. She'd heard him say that before. It's an entirely different pace of life, is? He called it island time.
"Right. Well, no need to keep you."
Okay, I'll talk to you later.
He was gone as soon as he said the last word. She tossed her phone aside. He hadn't seemed spooked by the mention of closets. Was she letting what she'd found trouble her for no reason? The light snapped on, and she heard the heater start soon after. She'd turned the temperature up to battle the cold. Drawing a deep, calming breath, she tried, once again, to shove her misgivings to the back of her mind. In some ways, with the lights and heater on, she felt much safer. But in others, having the power back didn't help at all. Surely she wasn't about to marry a man who was capable of doing any of the terrible things a collection like that might signify. Was she? 3. A few minutes after the generator came on, Ismay heard another knock and hurried to open the front door. Beau stood there. The porch light was now working, but his hood was up, keeping most of his face in shadow. "Thanks for coming to my rescue," she said. "I'm sorry it meant you had to be dragged into the wet cold." He kept his flashlight angled at the floor.
No problem. It's my job,
he said, shrugging off the credit. "Still, I appreciate it." She leaned farther outside in an effort to check the progress of the storm. "I've never seen weather like this. Have you?"
I grew up in Florida and Louisiana, so I've been in a hurricane or two, but nothing that bad up here.
He looked to be about her age, maybe a few years older, so she guessed he was around 9 or 10 when Katrina hit the Gulf Coast in 2005. She'd been 6 and would never forget her parents being glued to the TV, her mother crying over the lives that were lost. "You weren't in Louisiana for Katrina, were you?"
No, but I was there immediately after.
"Did you move to New Orleans or somewhere else?"
I lived with my great-uncle in a little village in the swampland south of NOLA.
That meant nothing to her. She'd never been there herself. "What brought you to the island?"
Just needed a change of pace.
Another big gust came up, blowing down his hood, but he didn't bother putting it back up. He looked impervious to the weather anyway, as if he was made of granite and nothing could hurt him. She wondered if he knew he gave that impression.
"Is there anything else I can do for you before I head back?"
he asked. "I'm set for now, I think. Do you have a generator too?"
No.
"Then let me give you your lantern."
Keep it,
he said before she could turn away.
I've got several flashlights and some candles. I can get by.
She'd have power and the good lantern? She'd grown up in a large family where she'd had to share everything, so she felt guilty taking all the best resources. "I'd rather you have it," he interrupted by raising his hand in the classic stop position, apparently in lieu of a refusal because he didn't say anything more about the lantern.
You have food and water, right?
"I do." Now that she had her basic needs covered, for the immediate future anyway, her concerns had shifted. What she needed was someone to convince her that Remy had nothing to do with the items she'd found in his closet.
"Can I give you my number in case anything comes up later?"
Beau asked.
"I'm just in the bungalow on the property behind this one, so not far away."
Getting his information seemed prudent. Although he was a stranger and certainly looked as though he'd be a formidable foe if she ever had to fight or resist him in any way, his manner and his help with the generator was making her more grateful than wary. After all, the Windsors knew and trusted him. That lent him some credibility. And if he had any intention of harming her, he could easily have done so by now. He knew how vulnerable she was. Instead, he was keeping a respectful distance and trying to help her through a frightening ordeal. "Of course," she said. "Good idea. Then we won't have to rely on Remy and Annabelle if we need to communicate." Except this time, she hadn't brought her phone to the door. It was back on the charger. She was planning to keep the battery as full as possible in case the generator gave out before the storm. "Can you come in for a second?"
"I'm wet," he said. "I'll wait here."
Her trust in him shot up several more notches. He certainly wasn't trying to get inside the house. "There's no need to stand out in the storm. Never mind if you drip on the floor. I can wipe it up after." Trying to keep the wind from ripping the door from her grasp, she stepped to one side to make room for him, and after a brief hesitation, he came in and helped her close the door.
"Whew! Now maybe we can hear each other speak without having to yell,"
she said, and went to retrieve her cell from the kitchen counter. When she returned, she found him exactly where she'd left him, right inside the door. "Here you go," she said, and handed him her phone so he could type in his information.
"If something comes up, don't hesitate to call me, even if it's late,"
he said when he handed it back. "Thank you." She hit the call button to ring his phone so he'd have her number too. "And I'd like to make you the same offer. If you need something tonight, feel free to reach out. As you can see, I'm pretty comfortable here and have enough groceries and water to share." After acknowledging her words with a nod, he headed out, and she once again braved the wind and the rain to watch him descend the stairs. When she couldn't see him anymore, she locked up, then leaned against the door. It felt odd, knowing there was a stranger staying not far away who'd given up his lantern for her. So what if he worked for the Windsors? Why did that mean he had to be the one to go without, especially when she had a generator? The privileges of money. She wasn't convinced her parents would approve of her letting him sacrifice when he already had less. But then she wasn't even convinced they approved of Remy. Although they hadn't said much, except that they wanted her to be happy, she knew they had to wonder why, since she and Remy had been together for so long, they'd never met him. He'd spoken to them several times over the phone, but every time she thought she might finally bring them together in person, for Christmas, Thanksgiving, Remy would end up having a conflict. Thinking of her parents made her miss them, the rest of her family, and, more than anything else, the familiar. She'd been excited to come to Mariners for a couple of months. Who wouldn't want to experience such luxury? Staying in a place like this was usually reserved for the very rich. Without Remy and his family, she wouldn't have had the opportunity. But the storm, and what she'd discovered while looking for a lighter, had left her feeling a bit like the second Mrs. Maxim de Winter in Rebecca, which had been her favorite book as a girl. There were secrets in this cottage. Even after the storm passed, the island recovered, and life carried on with its influx of tanned and beautiful tourists wearing designer sunglasses, she wouldn't be able to forget the duffel bag she'd put back behind the wall in Remy's old closet.
"Generator's working. All's good."
Beau sent that message to Annabelle Windsor as soon as he got home and removed his coat. Since he hoped to remain in his current situation for the foreseeable future, he planned to keep her happy. He peeled off his shirt, which was wet where the rain had seeped down the back of his neck while he'd been working, and tossed it onto the washer. Then, using only a flashlight, he went into the bathroom to dry his face and hair with a towel. Hopefully, Ismay Chalmers was set for the night, and he wouldn't have to go out again. He paused while he pictured the face of the woman he'd just met. She was beautiful. No one could argue with that.
But beauty didn't matter much to him. He wouldn't still be thinking about her, except there seemed to be something more to Ismay, something he would hate to see get crushed or turned into a reflection of Remy, or even Remy's mother, who was a much better person than her son. Ismay seemed fresh and unjaded, sweet and concerned about others. He wished he could warn her away from the Windsors. "Money ruins people," he muttered, recalling Annabelle's words yet again. But, like him, Ismay probably thought she could be the exception. With a sigh, he pulled on a dry shirt and returned to his small living room, where he built a fire to stave off the cold. There wasn't much to do with the rest of the afternoon, except prepare what food he could make without an oven or microwave, and read. He had extra batteries, and he wasn't hungry quite yet, so he decided to wait until later to have dinner. Using his flashlight to be able to see well enough to read, he opened Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. He didn't have much of an education, had barely attended school after his uncle took him in. Most people on their tiny island, the ones he'd associated with anyway, were uneducated and subsisted on very little other than what they could get from fishing or shrimping. So he'd never had much access to learning materials. He'd certainly never read for pleasure. But while he was in prison, books had become his salvation, and they were still a huge part of his life. He blitzed through almost any book he could find, craved information the way others craved sex, sugar, praise, or money, and visited the library on the island, which had been established way back in the mid-19th century by the son of the whale oil merchant who'd founded Mariners. In fact, he went there probably more than anyone else and had devoured hundreds of books since he'd arrived. He used the internet, too, mostly when he needed to know how to build something or make repairs. Beau could move as fast as he liked and study only what interested him, and he was surprised by how important learning had become to a boy without so much as a high school diploma. His phone signaled a call. Reluctantly setting his book aside, he checked to make sure it wasn't his employer or the woman he was supposed to be looking out for during the storm. It was neither, but his chest constricted when he saw the name. Matilda was calling again. After so long, why was his sister reaching out to him? He had no answer for that, but just the thought of speaking to her made him feel as though someone had slugged him in the gut. So, once again, he didn't answer. For the third time in as many months, he silenced his phone and put it down. Then he closed his eyes and took a deep, cleansing breath as he struggled to bury the pain even deeper before returning to his book. Ismay curled her feet underneath her on the couch and opened her laptop. She'd never heard of a string of women going missing or being murdered on Mariners, but she lived across the country, where the news could have been muted by more local happenings. She also hadn't paid much attention to current events while growing up. Since she'd become an adult, she liked watching Dateline and Forensic Files when she had a free minute, which was probably why her mind kept going back to the items in that darn duffel bag. But during the past decade, free minutes had been hard to come by, and she'd never seen an episode that had anything to do with Mariners, other than the case where a 12-year-old girl went missing in 2000 or 2001. The police couldn't figure out what had happened to her, and then her body turned up, fairly recently, near the lighthouse. While sad, that case had never concerned her personally, and it still didn't. From what she'd heard and read, the police had finally figured out who killed Emily Hutchins and why, and it had nothing to do with Remy or anyone connected to him. She told herself the duffel and its contents meant nothing. But she had hours to fill while waiting for the storm to blow over, so she found herself searching the internet for unsolved cases on Mariners, missing women on Mariners, rape on Mariners, and murder on Mariners. Almost every link went to the Emily Hutchins case. See, you're assuming far too much. Except There had to be a reason, even if it wasn't the one that first came to mind. Those items had been hidden so carefully. She typed in, "Mariners, underwear." Nothing came up, just a bunch of information about Mariners in general. Its history, its Nantucket-like architecture, its towering elms, its quaint shops and cobbled streets, and a few ads selling underwear. She changed her search parameters once again, this time to Mariners, stolen underwear. Still nothing. If there was a string of terrible crimes that had happened here, there'd be some news piece written about it. The wealthy people who frequented the island would be outraged. That meant she shouldn't be worried. She'd done her research and turned up nothing. She started to close her laptop. She wanted to be done with this. Except she could have been putting in the wrong information. Could these items be tied to crimes in New York City instead, where Remy and his brother had grown up? She winced at her uncertainty. It was completely far-fetched, way beyond anything Remy would ever consider doing. Of course. But she had to explore all possibilities. She wouldn't wreck her life by sticking her head in the sand just because she didn't want to face a hard truth. What would police say to the wife who found such a duffel bag and did nothing about it? They'd think she had to know what her husband was up to. Using keywords to bring up cold cases in New York instead of Mariners, Ismay wound up with the opposite problem. There were so many violent crimes, it was overwhelming. To narrow her results, she tightened her parameters to the period when Remy would have been living at home, but the list was still too long. Unbelievable. Setting her laptop aside, she went to his room and got the bag, snapped a picture of the girl's picture she'd found inside it, and tried to use Google's facial recognition feature. If it could tell her the identity of the person in the photograph, she'd be able to use that to guide her search. But it was such a blurry old photo, the effort proved futile. With a sigh, she checked her phone to see if Remy had tried to reach her since she'd let him know the generator was on. She hadn't received a response to her text. He could be so caught up in his own goals. There were moments, plenty of them, when she just didn't feel important to him. He assured her she was misreading him, but maybe that tendency to withdraw, to be so aloof, was why she was alarmed about what she'd found. It could be difficult to feel close to him, to feel as though she really knew him. Certain she'd feel better if she could just hear his voice, she considered calling him. The storm had put her in a strange frame of mind. It was making her see things in their worst possible light. She couldn't imagine she'd be spending so much time scouring the internet if she'd found that bag back at their apartment. Actually, it would be weird even there, she decided, which was why she didn't call him. What could she say? She certainly wasn't going to tell him what she'd been doing for the past 2 hours, and she needed to let him study, or he'd blame her if he failed. She stared at the old photograph she'd found a little longer. The young subject was attractive, with thick blonde hair and maybe brown eyes. It was hard to tell. She also had a gorgeous tan and was standing on the beach in front of Windsor Cottage. No one's gone missing on Mariners. Determined to stop her imagination, she returned the bag to its hiding place. Then, when she got back on her computer, she changed her search parameters yet again. She was going to forget about what she'd found in that closet and satisfy a far milder curiosity. Who was Beau Broussard? She no longer entertained the idea that he might have something to do with the items in that duffel bag. He'd made no move to harm her, even though the storm would have given him the perfect cover. And she felt certain that, were it his, he would have stored it at his own place, where he could reach it whenever he wanted to. Putting that bag in the cottage meant he'd have to worry about the family finding it, or getting in the way when he wanted to retrieve it. There were quite a few Beau Broussards on the internet, but none of them seemed to be the man she'd met. She couldn't find him on social media, either.
Picking up her phone, she eyed the contact record she'd created when he gave her his information. Then she checked the clock. It was 6:10. It had been 2.5 hours since he'd come over to help her. She wondered what he was doing, if he had food and water, if he still had a working flashlight, if he regretted not accepting the lantern she'd offered him. And, just in case he wouldn't reach out even if he needed something, she sent him a message. "It's Ismay, at the cottage. You doing okay over there?" 4. Beau had fallen asleep in his chair, but the sound of breaking glass and creaking timbers woke him instantly. Convinced he was still in prison and the siren had gone off because a fight had just broken out in the yard, he brought his head up quickly and his fists, too. There was no human adversary, but when he sprang to his feet, he dropped his phone and his book, and the book landed on his foot. "Son of a bitch!" he yelled, shocked that something falling such a short distance could cause so much pain. He didn't have time to focus on it, though. He wasn't in prison, fighting off a shank to the throat. He was in his small cabin on Mariners, looking at the sky and feeling the wind and rain hit him almost as hard as if he were standing outside. What the hell? He blinked. Another tree had gone down, only this one hadn't fallen as propitiously as the one that had broken the fence surrounding the garden. This tree had crashed through his roof and was lying on top of the house. Because he had only the dying embers of the fire to help him see, it took a moment to realize the extent of the damage. But soon he could make out the wet, dripping branches reaching down toward him. Apparently, the wind had only grown stronger since he'd fallen asleep. He searched where he'd been sitting for his flashlight. It had rolled off his lap and into the crack between the cushion and frame. He found it with the beam angled into the fabric. But even once he turned it around, it didn't show him much. The light was so dim it had almost gone out. He needed to replace the batteries, figure out how to get the tree off his house, and patch the hole it had made before he was facing significant water damage. But the second that thought went through his mind, he realized he wouldn't be able to do anything until the storm was over. He'd be a fool to even try. Afraid the frame of the house would give way and he'd be looking at an even more dangerous problem, he picked up his phone and saw a text he'd missed while sleeping. The woman staying in the cottage had messaged him, "You doing okay over there?" That text had come in 3 hours ago, and then, more recently, he'd received another message from her. "Hey, you haven't answered me. Can you just confirm that you're okay?" And, just a few minutes ago, "I'm really getting worried." What should he say in return? That he wasn't okay? That a tree had just taken out part of his house? She'd think he expected her to let him stay in the cottage, and he knew Annabelle and Mort would not like that, never mind Remy. He didn't like the idea either. What if she accused him of doing something he didn't do, something inappropriate, and he had no way to defend himself? He was an ex-con. If a question like that ever arose, his conviction and the fact that he'd lied about his past would make him look guilty, even if he was innocent. He wouldn't risk returning to prison. He didn't really know Ismay Chalmers, would be a fool to trust her. After carefully navigating around the tree and the chunks of wood, sheetrock, and roofing that were now on the floor, he made it to the kitchen and replaced the batteries in his flashlight before responding, "Sorry, fell asleep." He peered around the corner at the hole where the rain was pouring in before adding, "I'm fine," and sent the message. He'd figure out something to survive the night, he told himself. Hang out in a back bedroom and hope the rest of the house didn't go down, he supposed. He didn't have any better option. He was once again edging around the tree so he could make it down the hall when he heard someone banging on the door. At first he thought it was the storm knocking things around outside, but then he heard his name. "Beau? Beau Broussard! Are you in there?" Bam, bam, bam. "Are you hurt? Should I break a window?"
"Oh my God," he said. "She's at my door."
Ismay watched Beau out of the corner of her eye. She'd insisted he leave his cabin and come to the cottage with her, but she could tell he wasn't happy about it. Now, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket around his shoulders, soaked to the skin, while she made coffee. She wasn't much drier. She'd borrowed a coat from Annabelle's closet before making the harrowing trek to his place. When she'd packed for Mariners, she'd been expecting a mild spring and part of summer on the beach, and brought only a lightweight jacket. But she hadn't taken a hat or gloves or boots, and she definitely should have.
"I can't believe you went out in this mess,"
he muttered as he shot a disgruntled look at the storm ravaging the island outside the window. She had a towel draped around her shoulders, which she used as she moved around the kitchen to dry the water dripping from her hair. "Would you have preferred I didn't?" She'd been mildly concerned when he didn't respond to her first text, but Beau was a stranger. She had no idea what his habits were like, whether he was good about replying to his messages or not. She'd thought it was also possible he was busy and not checking his phone. So she'd opened a bottle of wine, continued surfing the internet, and called her brother Jack to pass the time. He was the second oldest in the family, next to her in age, and they'd always been close. It wasn't until Beau didn't answer her second message, and then her third, that she'd finally set her computer aside so she could go to every room in the cottage that had a window facing the back to see if she could spot his cabin. There were so many trees in the way that she couldn't catch even a glimpse of another building until she'd reached the master bedroom. Then she could barely make out the corner of what looked like a small cabin in a copse of trees beyond the garden, and was fairly certain that had to be where he was living. Once she'd spotted it, she'd debated whether to go check on him. She'd told herself that he was obviously a strong man and would be safe enough on his own. But something terrible could happen to anyone, strong or not, and when she'd spotted the tree that had fallen, she'd been glad she'd checked. She'd been terrified she'd find him hurt, possibly bleeding to death, in the freezing dark, pinned beneath a tree branch or debris from the roof. So she'd felt incredibly relieved when he'd answered the door.
"I would have been okay,"
he said. "Maybe, maybe not, but at the very least you would have been a lot less comfortable." With his shelter compromised the way it was, he would have been cold and miserable. And what if that tree fell any lower? The rest of the roof could cave in. He wouldn't want to be there if that happened. She poured him some coffee, offered him cream and sugar, which he declined, and set his cup in front of him. He thanked her, but made no response to her comment. She got the impression that if he'd said something, it would have been, "That depends on what you mean by comfortable." Beau Broussard wasn't the most social person in the world. That was becoming obvious. He seemed skeptical of others, including her. She could easily guess he preferred to remain on his own, regardless of the risks. "You hungry?" she asked. When he opened his mouth to answer, she put up a hand to stop him. "Never mind, you'll probably say no. You say no to everything."
"Because yes can get you into trouble,"
he said. "In what way?"
"I won't elaborate."
He'd initially refused to come to the cottage, even though it was safe and dry and had power, and he'd refused to have a glass of wine with her, agreeing only reluctantly to let her make him coffee when she offered that instead. "Well, I'm hungry, so I'm going to make pasta carbonara. If you'd like to have some, there'll be plenty."
"Pasta carbonara?"
he echoed. "Pasta in a white sauce with pancetta and Italian bacon, Parmesan cheese, and peas." He let it go at that, but watched her warily, as if she could be as unpredictable as a fox or raccoon or other wild animal. Where had the Windsors found this man? He certainly wasn't anything like the spoiled, wealthy, designer brand-wearing frat boys who'd gotten off the ferry with her when she'd arrived. Of course, those young men were here to be served. They weren't among those who'd be doing the serving. But still,
The difference was marked. "You told me you were from Louisiana," she said, as she got out a frying pan for the pancetta. "Did you like it there?" "It has its attractions." "What brought you to Mariners?" Although she'd asked once before, she hadn't gotten much of an answer. He set his cup on the table. "I came for a lot of reasons." When he left it at that, she chuckled. "A lot of reasons? What, are they all secret?" He didn't crack a smile, even though, in her opinion, he couldn't miss that she'd been joking. "Of course not. I have nothing to hide." She studied him more openly. This man was different from anyone she'd met before. He was polite, hadn't said anything out of line, and yet he was so guarded. "Okay. So you came to Mariners because—" "I knew this place had to have more opportunities than where I come from." The pancetta she'd put in the frying pan began to sizzle and pop and fill the kitchen with the sublime smell of frying pork. "What about the uncle who raised you?" "What about him?" "He's still around?" "He's getting old, but he's still there." "I bet he hated to see you go." "I was an adult." He took a drink of his coffee. "I'm sure he expected me to leave at some point." She got out a pan and filled it with water so she could boil the pasta. "I've never been to a swamp. Are they truly like how they're depicted on TV?" "Have you read Where the Crawdads Sing?" She paused from cooking to take a sip of her wine. "No." "You might like it. I did." "Because you grew up where that book was set?" she guessed, while topping up his coffee. "No, it's set in the marshes of North Carolina, but there are marked similarities." With the water on the stove set on high heat, she returned to frying the pancetta. "What's the name of the village where you lived? And how far is it from New Orleans?" He arched an eyebrow as he looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Do you always ask so many questions?" "I'm an attorney," she said. "I'll be starting my own practice in July. Talking is a tool of the trade, I guess." "What kind of attorney?" "Nothing too glamorous. Wills and trusts." "You're smart to stay out of the criminal system." "Why do you say that?" "It's a tough world." "Too dark for me. Anyway, since we're both here with nothing except time on our hands, would it be so bad to get to know each other?" He didn't reassure her. His eyes narrowed a bit, as if he was taking her measure. "That depends." "On?" He asked a question instead of answering. "Where'd you meet Remy?" "At UCLA. "You had a class together?" "No, I tried to avoid the classes he had to take." She grimaced. "I'd pass out if I had to dissect a cadaver." "That sort of thing doesn't bother him?" "Not in the least." As she heard her own answer, she cringed inside. Her fiancé's level of comfort with corpses didn't mean anything, did it? Because when she put that fact together with what she'd found in his closet and those gruesome pictures, a chill ran down her spine. "So, I know where you didn't meet," Beau said, essentially pointing out that she hadn't answered his question. "Oh, right." She forced a fresh smile. "I studied in the same place at the library almost every day. One afternoon, he sat down at my table and we struck up a conversation. Then he returned the next day, and the next, and eventually asked for my number." The blanket fell from Beau's shoulders as he leaned forward, his large hands cradling his cup. "How long have you been together?" 3 years. "You must get along well?" "We do okay." He was so tight-lipped, it made her tight-lipped, too, at least on complicated subjects like her relationship with Remy. There was so much she admired about her fiancé. She didn't want to lose him and the good things, the good times, but she definitely had her misgivings. "When's the wedding?" "Haven't set a date yet." "See?" she joked. "You asked, and I answered." "Even you seem reticent about certain subjects."
Reticent wasn't a word she'd expect a handyman to use, and there'd been other words. Was he well educated? He seemed intelligent. I wasn't reticent, just distracted, she explained. She had good reason to be. She wasn't going to mention what was in the closet of Remy's bedroom, but she was keenly aware of having a picture on her phone of the girl whose photograph was in the duffel bag. Ask me anything. What else would you like to know? She grinned at him, but he remained wary. She was beginning to wonder what it would take to get him to relax and smile.
Okay,
he said.
Are you really going to marry Remy?
She froze with the spatula she was using in her hand. He'd said that as if it would be a mistake, which surprised her. Most people considered marrying a handsome, athletic young man from a wealthy family, who was going to be a doctor, no less, a major catch. You don't think I should? He pulled his gaze away from her.
I didn't say that.
It's what you meant, though, wasn't it? Apparently, when Beau did finally speak, he didn't bother with small talk.
It was merely a question. You were the one who wanted us to get to know each other.
That was a dodge. Beau seemed tempted to open up and really talk to her, but for some reason, he wouldn't. We're thinking a spring wedding might be nice, she said.
Next year?
That suddenly seemed too soon. Unless I put it off, or call it off. He held his cup halfway to his mouth.
Are you thinking about doing that?
She scowled at him. What? He said, spreading out his hands.
It's not as much fun when you're the one answering personal questions.
I don't mind. It's just... He didn't know how shaken she was by what she'd found, and she couldn't tell him about it without feeling disloyal to her fiancé. Even if those items didn't signify the worst, they had to mean something, and she couldn't think of a good reason for them to be there. Never mind. It's not your turn anymore. That's all.
My turn?
What does your uncle do for a living? She asked, taking over the questioning. The way he looked at her suggested he'd allow her the lead, but would tolerate only so much of an invasion of his privacy, and she was interested in learning just how far he'd let her go. There was something understated and mysterious about this man. He reminded her of an iceberg. He showed only about 10% of who he really was. The other 90% remained hidden deep below the surface.
He does what everyone else in the village does. He fishes for crawdads, shrimp, crab. That's how he gets by.
You don't have any other family?
I have a younger sister.
She hadn't expected that. Where is she?
I don't know.
Was he serious? She couldn't even imagine what would cause her to lose touch with her siblings to that degree. Despite all the chaos and competition they'd known growing up, they loved and supported each other when times grew hard. You're not close?
My mother died when I was 10.
He lifted his cup again.
Things would probably be a lot different if that hadn't happened.
Generator keeping the lights on, Beau sitting at the table looking powerful enough to protect her from almost anything, and the steam from the water, which was starting to boil, floating up to warm her face. She could almost forget about the storm outside. She felt sick.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.